Hi everybody, it's Marlene with Eerie News and I am back with more. Never fear, Marlene is here. More interesting, weird, true crime, you name it. I've got it for you. The first story out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, of course, is this is not true crime, but in a way it's like a cold case. And again, sometimes it's incredible. Sometimes there's so much even under circumstances or locations where you say there's so many people around of obviously somebody must have seen something and it turns out nobody really does or they say they don't, or what you will find, and I'm not saying in this case you'll hear about it, where sometimes the suspect is somebody within the family and the family is afraid. In other words, the damage is done, that other family member was killed, and they think, you know what, if we dig further with this in order, like we know it was one of our own, all the dirty laundry of the family is going to get exposed. And they just want to bury it. And I don't know, listen to this story and you tell me what you think. This is titled Not for Love or Money. All right, here we go. Some say that men believe in ghosts and haunted houses and unlucky days as devoutly as they do in the Bible. For old New Yorkers, leases would not be signed if the occupancy was to start on a Saturday, which was considered an unlucky day. Also, if a house got the reputation for being haunted, it would stand unoccupied for months. There was a haunted house in every eligible neighborhood, and while everything around it sold quickly, the house, despite being improved, stayed unsold. Those who could be induced to take it at a low rent worried about customers not coming there if they ran a business from the ground floor. Now remember, these are also the times where people were, how's the word? What's the word I'm looking for? More religious or more strictly religious or observant, whatever their denomination was. But still, is describing where there's a very, very high level of superstition across the board. So here we go. The Nathan House was one of these properties. It was one of the finest mansions on 23rd Street, located only one house away from Fifth Avenue and opposite the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Superbly furnished, it was offered for a song when no one would pay its worth. One or two families were willing to take it, but no servant would live in the place. After standing empty for 2 or 3 years, it was given over to trade. But ladies would not cross the doomed threshold. Even this does not seem to have silenced the voice of blood, was written in later years. The story of the Nathan House. Dr. Peckham's splendid mansion on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 23rd Street was separated from the Nathan House by a small yard measuring 25 feet wide. The side window of the Nathan House looked out upon the rear window of Dr. Peckham's house. On the night of July 28, 1870, the windows were open and around 2 a.m. a storm had just passed. Suddenly Mrs. Peckham heard a heavy sound as of a body falling on a floor. She woke her husband and told him she thought there was someone in the house. He listened and then another heavy sound, more like a crack of a pistol, broke the silence. The third sound followed and then it became quiet. Dr. Peckham went to the window and told his wife the noise was coming from the Nathan house. Later, when the murder was announced, the sounds took on a terrible meaning. The next morning, Dr. Peckham visited his neighbor's house and examined the body of Mr. Nathan. He opined the man had been awoken by the noise of someone tampering with his safe. He came out of bed to see who was there. This was when he received a blow from the iron dog, which stunned him to where he was unable to call out for help. He was dragged into another room where he was beaten to death. This would turn out to be the first of several theories offered to explain how the wealthy broker met his end. Upon better examination of his wounds, it appeared Nathan had been hit from behind. Possibly while he was at his writing desk, he received 15 blows to the head. The Nathan house was a four-story brownstone front mansion. The second floor where the murder was committed was peculiarly arranged. The large front apartments with two windows open on 23rd Street, with a reception room and a door on the west wall, which opened into a small hall room fitted up as an office. Back of it, near the main hall, was a long dark passageway with massive black walnut clothes presses, reaching from the floor to the ceiling. At the other end of this hall was a bathroom. These two compartments occupied one fifth the width of the reception room, and the other half was occupied by two dressing rooms furnished with a marble basin. Mr. Nathan was discovered by his sons Frederick, 26, and Washington, 22, about 6 a.m. He was full of blood from head to foot, and his face and eyes were bruised. On his head were terrible wounds, while both hands were bruised, and some of the fingers were broken. There was evidence of a struggle in the room, but nowhere else. The safe had been forced open. Nathan's gold watch, a stem winder made by Jurgensen numbered 7401, and a set of diamond studs were missing. The instrument of death was found in the hall below, near the front door. It was known as a ship carpenter's dog, which was a long, thick piece of wood, a long, thick piece of iron, not unlike a car hook. There was blood and hair on it. hmm And I want you to think about the, you know, that's well, obviously they wanted to kill him, but whoever went in there was prepared to like, I'm gonna get my. It wasn't a simple robbery. In other words, I imagine that if you break into someone's house, in the night, you might be prepared to kill them. I guess is what I'm saying. Okay, just saying. The sons had last seen their father shortly after midnight when they went to the third floor, where their rooms were at. Mr. Nathan had his room on the second floor. It was unknown if the thief entered through the front door, which had been left open much of the preceding day as carpenters were at work in the house, or by false keys or window. There were no marks of forced entry, and no one in the house heard any noise during the night. Officer Mangam, who walked the beat on 23rd Street, said he tried the entrance door at 1:30 and 4:30 as was his custom and it was locked. Later, he found the basement door unlocked. Washington Nathan told police, I believe the man or men who committed the murder were secreted in the house, and I am sure the murder was committed for robbery and not revenge. Benjamin Nathan and his sons had returned to New York from New Jersey since Mr. Nathan planned to attend their synagogue, Sharish Israel, to commemorate the anniversary of his mother's death a year earlier. The first clue a crime had been committed came from a newsboy, John Nees, who came to leave the newspaper about 5 a.m. and found the front door open. Thinking the servants were up early and were going to clean the entrance, he went to the next house over, number 14, and folded his papers there. This was the house where Edith Newbold Jones resided. She would grow up to become the famous writer Edith Wharton, but on that day she was only 8 years old and had no idea of the horror that unfolded so close to her home. While the newsboy finished his task, he saw a man dressed like a laborer approaching with a dinner pail in hand. He stopped in front of the Nathan house, went up the steps, and took a white paper at the top. Once the boy heard of the murder, he went to the police with what he had seen. Due to the notoriety of the crime, Police Chief John Jordan and Chief Detective James J. Kelso took over the investigation. Jordan had only been police chief since April. An $850 reward was offered for the identification of the man who killed Mr. Nathan. It was thought he might be the man seen to pick up something like a check that was lying on the top front doorstep of the house. The reward money increased steadily until $30,000 were offered for the arrest and conviction of the murderer. Separate rewards were offered: $1,000 for the recovery of the three diamond shirt studs, $1,500 for identification and recovery of the watch, and $1,000 for information of the instrument of death. On August 12th, a few days into the inquest, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle protested the disparity in treatment between Washington and Frederick and the Irish Catholic servants of the Nathan family who had suddenly become the prime suspects. An anonymous reporter wrote, quote, the inquiry has been marked by notable concessions to the sensibilities of wealthy parties under suspicion and by wanton war upon the equal sensibilities of poor parties. The two sons of the murdered man and his other relative, a Hebrew minister, were examined with tenderness, courtesy, and with supreme deference to their habits, situations, and characters. End quote. Meanwhile, the maid Ann Kelly and her son William, who lived in the attic and sometimes did odd jobs for Benjamin, were subjected to grueling questioning that put them in the role of prime suspects. The son was by interrogatories accused of bastardy, burglary, theft, bounty jumping, perjury, vagrancy, fornication, and murder. The inquest lasted almost 30 days, and it had more to do with clearing Washington Nathan than to discover the perpetrator of the crime. Washington Nathan admitted to drinking at the St. James Hotel, visiting Delmonico's, and ending the night at a brothel on East 14th Street with a prostitute named Clara Dale. She corroborated his story. The inquest concluded that Benjamin Nathan was found to have been murdered by a person or persons unknown. 8 months later, a story circulated that the mystery of the Nathan murder had been solved. Superintendent Kelso said the murderer was a thief and desperado named William Forrester, who was known by half a dozen aliases. Kelso also sent a circular throughout the USA, Canada, and Europe that read, quote, $2,500 will be paid for the arrest and delivery to the office of the Superintendent of Police in the City of New York of Billy Forrester, alias Billy Marshall, Billy or Frank Campbell, Frank Livingstone, Frank Harding, and Frank Howard. End quote. Forrester was described as being 35 years old. He stood 5 feet 6 inches, weighed 140 pounds, with a slim, wiry build with broad, square shoulders. He had a long face, black eyes, with a wild expression, a high forehead, narrow mouth, a straight nose, black hair cut short, a heavy black mustache, sunken cheeks but high cheekbones, small narrow foot, and he usually walked with his hands in his coat pockets. He was missing a tooth out of the upper jaw, and a tattoo in India ink of a bracelet encircled his left wrist. Forrester had been a thief for most of his life and served several terms in state prison. He was wanted in Joliet, Illinois after escaping while serving a 13-year sentence. A photograph was attached to the circular, and Kelso complained that detectives in other cities lacked in cooperation. He declined to say how he obtained this information. Many believe his source was George Ellis, a prisoner serving time in Sing Sing for burglary he committed on January 27, 1870. He had robbed the office of S&M Miggle at 2030 East 25th Street, taking thousands of dollars worth of diamonds. Benjamin Nathan was killed 2 months after Ellis was sentenced, and supposedly he confided in one of the prison guards as to who the killer was. Months before Kelso circulated the story that he had discovered the perpetrator of the crime, it was Superintendent John Jourdan who questioned the prisoner. George Ellis said that he and Billy Forrester had planned the murder, but it was Forrester who carried it out. Undoubtedly, he did not expect Nathan and his sons to be in the house, as it was known the family was spending the summer in the country at Morristown, New Jersey. Ellis said to one of the detectives, "I'm not in this case, but I'll tell you, the man that killed Benjamin Nathan is killing Superintendent Jourdan. The chief knows who the murderer is, and the secret is taking him to the grave." George Ellis might have been a convict, but there was truth in his words because Superintendent Jourdan died October 1st, 1872, 2 months after the Nathan murder. He died of pleurisy at the age of 41. Was Ellis also correct when he said that Jourdan knew the identity of the killer? Perhaps it had not been Billy Forrester after all. Police Captain George Washington Walling described in his book Recollections of a New York Chief of Police that from the day of Nathan's death, Jourdan failed. He never made a step in advance and died a few months afterwards. Also disturbing was that the murder weapon disappeared from the police station. A bundle of clothing was taken from the house the afternoon of the murder, but the laundress refused to speak to the police. The carpet drenched and Mr. Nathan's blood was sent to be cleaned the same day. It was theorized the thief was discovered by Nathan while trying to open the safe, and he was killed by Forrester with the iron dog. The weapon was alleged to have been stolen from the wine cellar of J.F. Church in Fifth Avenue, which was burglarized some time before. To lend credence to their suspicions, Forrester had not been seen at any of his regular haunts in different cities since after the murder, or in the company of his regular friends. He was well known to the heads of police in various cities, especially for his talent in escaping. It was believed he fled out west or was in some small country town working as a laborer. By April of 1871, the murder house was said to be haunted by the ghost of Benjamin Nathan. Was it perhaps because he had designed the home and overseen every detail of its construction, or was it because his killer still roamed free and unpunished? There were rumors that someone had bought it for a reduced price, and another was that a noted gamester rented it to use as a faro bank. One fact was undeniable, which was that no one wanted to take the house because of its sinister reputation. The Nathan family abandoned the house immediately after the patriarch's murder. They left the furniture behind with a servant as a caretaker. They denied ever placing the property up for sale. Many of the neighbors discarded the sneak thief theory, which left only a crime motivated by revenge or some other personal reason. By October 1872, Forrester had not been arrested, and now a chemist named George Kelsey was reported to have recognized him as the man who ran from the Nathan house. The months rolled by, and the Nathan murder remained a mystery. Forrester was captured and sent to Joliet prison to serve out a sentence. He was never indicted for the Nathan murder since he provided an alibi. $10,000 worth of bonds that were taken from the safe were seen in the possession of Dan Kelly, who was attempting to negotiate them. Some policemen said that Dan Kelly admitted to killing Benjamin Nathan. Supposedly, the dog was given to Dan Kelly a few nights before the crime by a caulker who worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The men had met in the Oriental Saloon located at Grand East Broadway. The caulker lived in Staten Street, however, he died on January 27, 1872, and it was believed the murder had much to do with the man's unexpected death. Now the story changed, and it was said the robbery was planned by a German woman who lodged with Billy Johnson and then with John T. Irving, who was a professional thief. The woman was Nathan's housekeeper. On August 28, 1873, while serving time in San Francisco, Irving confessed to the murder of Benjamin Nathan. He said the housekeeper's son got him to commit the murder at the suggestion of Washington Nathan. He was brought to New York and he described the iron dog used in the crime. Excuse me. He said it was stolen from a carpenter shop. In his New York home, he had some of the stolen stock and a memorandum book of Mr. Nathan's with the name of Albert Cardozo, Samuel Lewis Cummings of 14th Street, and Dr. Leo. According to him, they had netted between $6,000 to $7,000 for the crime. He said the murder was committed about 9 o'clock in the evening and he left the house about 6 in the morning. The watch and chain stolen the night of the murder was pawned at Abraham Goodman's store at 31 Center Street at the corner of Reed the day after the crime. It was redeemed 6 months after. John Irving implicated Caleb Guinon, Nick Jones, Daniel Kelly, no relation to the Nathan's housekeeper, and a man known only as McNally. He promised to provide evidence to go along with his written confession if the charges were dropped for crimes committed in New York. Irving's wife lived over a grocery store at the corner of Hester and Mott Streets. The police interviewed her several times. She denied that she had the papers. Born in Irvington, New York, John T. Irving claimed relations to the writer Washington Irving, which is perhaps why he had such a vivid imagination. It was believed his confession, like those before, was probably a hoax. In September 1873, William Howe, counsel for John T. Irving, said that the whole of Irving's story was false. He denied Washington Nathan had anything to do with putting up the job to rob the house. By then, Superintendent Kelso had followed his associate John Jourdan to the grave. So it's funny because, within a year, both of the main people that went into the initial investigation of the murder had died. Wow. In 1873, it was noted in the newspapers that John C. Heenan died leaving behind $100,000. He had made this money by keeping a gambling house. He was put into business by William M. Tweed, and in 1870 had three partners: William Cridge, Michael Big Mike Murray, and John J. Kelso, formerly superintendent of the police. The four divided $20,000 a month in profits. Kelso left the partnership when he left the police. This called into question the reliability of police who were assigned to investigate the Nathan murder. Even though Irving's story was discounted as being accurate, the name of Albert Cardozo in Benjamin Nathan's memorandum book did have significance. In 1854, Albert Cardozo married Benjamin's sister Rebecca. He was then a young lawyer, and Benjamin used his connections to help launch his career. Months before the murder, Cardozo named his son Benjamin Nathan Cardozo, a child who would become a Supreme Court justice. In 1859, Albert Cardozo joined the Tammany Society, and 5 years later he had become a judge. He was complicit with George Bernard and Judge John McCune in helping William Boss Tweed raid New York City coffers. Throughout 8 years, they netted $30 million. The scandal brought about his resignation, and he died in 1885 at the age of 45 from Bright's disease. Robert Nathan, Benjamin's brother, thought Cardozo impeded the murder investigation, not to save his skin, but to save face for the family and himself if Washington Nathan was indicted for his father's murder. Cardozo faced an upcoming election, and a family scandal would have hurt his campaign. With his connections through Tammany Hall, he could control the police. However, he could control the police, the mayor, a majority of the press, and the courts. He had motive and the ability to stymie efforts in the case. In 1875, a sensational crime pamphlet was published by Barclay, supposedly based on actual events. It was titled "A Great Number of Mysterious Murders Revealed: The Life of Anson Bunker." The bloody hand, the perpetrator of no less than 15 cold-blooded murders, among which were the great Nathan murder of New York City and those of his three wives, and several others in various parts of the country, his horrible confessions and terrible doom. By the way, that's part of the title or the subtitle, that long thing. Anyway, it's believed it was published as a publicity boost associated with solving a notorious crime. The memoir, authored by the mysterious Bunker, who was never proved to have existed, was discovered on his dead body after he was murdered and dumped in a cave in the lava beds of Northern California. In 1878, Aaron B. Rollins, the coroner who had presided over the inquest, like many who were involved in the original investigation, died. Within 8 years of the Nathan murder, Police Chief John Jordan, Chief Detective James J. Kelser, and Coroner Aaron B. Rollins had died. See what I mean? In 1880, Thomas A. Duran died. He was employed as a janitor and lawyer James Oliver's office. He was, until a few years before, one of the most celebrated detectives in the city. He joined the police force in 1863 and worked for Superintendent Kelso and was John Jordan's confidant. He was assigned in the Nathan murder, and among the arrestees was William Forrester, a main suspect in the Nathan case. In 1874, he traded blows with Captain McCullough, after which he resigned. It was noted he died in poverty, and James Oliver paid for his burial. So this poor guy, he's an up-and-coming police officer, and he's even a confidant of two of the main people involved in this case. Now, remember, this was a very serious case. First of all, Nathan was a prominent stockbroker. He was very wealthy. He was well known, and remember, he got killed inside his house. It's the equivalent now of a high-profile homicide case where supposedly only the best are put to solve it, and people expect results. And guess what? It wasn't happening. So anyway, this poor guy, I guess he hits his captain. Who knows for what reason? Next thing you know, he ends up being a janitor. All right. In 1874, Estelle Nathan, Benjamin's Nathan eldest daughter, died at the age of 28. On January 18th, 1879, Emily Nathan, Benjamin's widow, passed away from pneumonia. It was noted she belonged to the Hendricks family, one of the oldest Jewish families in New York. She was related by blood or marriage to the most conspicuous Jewish families in the city. Her father, Harmon, supported the American Revolution. It was noted the Nathans were descendants of an old Portuguese family who fled to escape the Inquisition. By then, the Nathan house was reconstructed and the lower stories were used by express companies. The upper floors were let as apartments to bachelors. The house had been without a tenant for years. It was observed that everything was done to obliterate the memory of the terrible crime, especially the scene, even though it was considered the most perfect building in the city. 4 months after his mother's death, Washington Nathan was shot in the neck by an actress. It happened at the Coleman House, a hotel on Broadway. It turned out that Alice Harrison, a singer, kept an apartment there. One day, a well dressed woman, accompanied by a servant, arrived seeking a room. She registered as Miss Ruland from Philadelphia. She insisted on a room on the first floor, which was where Alice Harrison stayed. Miss Ruland waited in the lobby until she spied Washington Nathan going into Alice's rooms. He was heavily muffled and sped across the entrance, but she recognized him. She followed him, burst into the room, and fired 2 shots, both aimed at Washington's head. Alice Harrison ran from the room looking for help. By the time the proprietor came to the apartment, Miss Ruland had retreated to her room. Washington Nathan turned up his coat collar, and fled from the hotel. He went to the nearest surgeon who dressed a wound behind his ear. A bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his neck and lodged under his skin. When the proprietor came to Ruland's apartment, he found her in a high state of agitation. She admitted to shooting Washington Nathan because of something he had done or said to Mrs. Barrett, which turned out to be one of her aliases. The proprietor didn't call the police and instead ordered her from the hotel. Less than half an hour later, she was gone. Alice Harrison also fled and didn't stop until she reached Boston. The police tried to trace Miss Ruland, who was thought to be the former Marion Ward, wife of an actor known as Irish Tim Ward. She was known to keep company with Washington, and it was thought the attack was motivated by jealousy. Once the mistress of a Mr. Barrett, she used the alias of Fanny Barrett as well as Bertie Bell. Whatever name she used, notoriety followed Miss Ruland like a bad stink. A hosier also had to track her down in order to extract payment for a pair of iridescent silk stockings worth $16 a pair. Washington's discarded mistress, who was known to run brothels, fled to Philadelphia, and 4 months later, Fanny Barrett, alias Bertie Bell, alias Marion Ward, was reported to be suffering from a severe attack of brain fever. It was said the police didn't pursue her because they doubted Washington Nathan would press charges. Fanny was the mistress of George Bernard, a judge who had been impeached for colluding with Boss Tweed to embezzle from the city. Bernard gave his mistress an allowance, which he used to fund Washington's extravagant lifestyle. For 4 years, when Washington Nathan was short on funds, it was Fanny Barrett who supported him financially. Once he was flush with money again, he would seek other female companionship. Upon the death of his mother, he had inherited $100,000 and Bertie Bell was cast aside. The wound, while non-threatening, didn't help Washington Nathan's reputation and stirred up suspicion against him regarding his father's murder. It turned out that Fanny Barrett had attempted to stab him 2 years before. Prior to the shooting, Washington Nathan was arrested for involvement in a midnight disturbance. The publicity of these events stemmed from his involvement in the fiascos. Washington Nathan was the eldest son of Benjamin Nathan, and it was said he had incurred his father's displeasure and was about to be cut off. He had a temper and often argued with his father over his drinking, whoring, and irresponsibility with money. The press wrote how he did not seem as heartbroken over his father's death like Frederick, but a difficult relationship between a father and son did not mean it would be a motive for murder. Benjamin had just lent Washington $5,000 to invest in the business. That he had qualms about his son's judgment was undeniable since he left each of his 8 children $75,000, but Washington's money was to be held in trust until he married a Jewish woman or attained the age of 25. Even then, his mother would have to sign a declaration that he was living an acceptable lifestyle. A month later, Washington Nathan was a passenger aboard the Britannic outbound for Europe. By October 1879, he found himself back in New York on a summons issued by the courts. The affair of the shooting was far from over. It seemed that Bertie Bell's real name was Mrs. T.B. Black, and she had hidden her identity behind another alias, that of Mrs. Wood. She lived in a fashionable flat at 300 West 57th Street. The judge handled the case behind closed doors, and the newspapermen never knew what the outcome had been. The Nathan family certainly pulled strings to keep the story out of the papers. In 1880, Wash Nathan sailed on the steamship Germanic for Liverpool. While visiting Brighton, he met Nina Elizabeth Armeet. She was divorced from Captain John Lees, or aka Jack Armeet, of the Navy Marines. She had 5 children by the marriage, only 2 which were still alive. On April 7th, 1881, the couple returned to the United States, and in a private ceremony at a small town on the Hudson, they exchanged vows. She was a daughter of Colonel J. H. Mapleson, who managed Her Majesty's Opera in London. She was 26 years old and was described as rather small and stout, and bears a striking resemblance to the other members of the Mapleson family. Not pretty, but attractive and expensive in her tastes. In 1883, Washington Nathan was back at court in order to decide a suit over his inheritance, in which he had broken a proviso which forbade him to marry a Christian. He had been ostracized by his New York relatives for marrying outside his faith. Washington Nathan died in 1892 and was buried in Dover Jewish Cemetery in Kent. His wife Nina died in October 1909 in Kent, England. They had a daughter, Malvina, born in 1882, and a son, Julian, in 1887. When Malvina Nathan married Edgar Peixoto in 1905, the wedding was celebrated at the residence of her uncle Frederick Nathan in New York. The wedding announcement in the newspaper incorrectly listed Malvina's mother as deceased when she was still alive, which, for all you know, they might have done that on purpose. Because, let's face it, she was the Christian he wasn't supposed to marry. Let's keep going. Perhaps she didn't want to attend the event considering where it was celebrated. The public believed that Billy Forrester, despite his reputation as a thorough scoundrel, was not involved in the murder and that he was not even in New York City when it took place. By 1900, 30 years had passed, and even with a reward that amounted to $47,500, none came forward to claim it, and no arrests were made. Public opinion was that it was done by one of the family. There were always doubts of how 4 other occupants in the house claimed they hadn't heard the struggle of Mr. Nathan with his attacker. Many asked themselves how the patriarch of a prominent Sephardic Jewish family and a respected member of the New York Stock Exchange could have been killed in his own home, and none could be brought to trial for it. A businessman who lived across the street from the Nathan's home argued that the superintendent of police, who entered the office poor during the Nathan investigation, was soon worth $200,000. All the old suspicions were revisited. The meaning was clear. He'd been bought off. Mrs. Kelly, the housekeeper, was never suspected since physically she could not have delivered the blows. However, her adult son William was a suspect. He was a handyman who received a small army pension. During the inquest, he was accused of deserting from the military, jumping bail, and consorting with a rough criminal crowd. The police stuck with their theory that the crime had been committed by professional burglars. But why would they attempt a robbery when Mr. Nathan and his sons were in the home, and use such an uncommon tool to beat the old man? Despite false confessions, suspicions, and innuendos, after 155 years, the murder of Benjamin Nathan remains unnamed. Now, this is something that was written up: A Haunting on Madison Avenue. A very famous mansion has just been sold under the name Hammer on Madison Avenue. An old fellow with a black pipe has for years put his head out of the upper windows occasionally and has the ability to curse everybody who lives under the roof. The house has been searched from coal bin to attic. No matter who comes or who goes, the old fellow abides. A strange fatality has so far attended every occupant of the house. At one time it was the abode of fashion. The lady of the mansion was the belle of New York and gave the most famous parties on the island. Her entertainments were the envy of New York, and the Knickerbockers could not compare with her in the magnificence of her receptions. But her star waned, and domestic disaster settled on her house. A wealthy New Yorker has bought the place and renovated it as he will. It is believed the old man will, as old, look out the window and do mischief. This was published in 1876 in the Alabama Beacon. So, What do you think? Do you think it was a robbery or do you think it was his son? The crazy guy, the black sheep. You could tell that he was what he was into. I don't know, drinking, consorting with prostitutes, you name it. And he was the oldest. Remember, because they placed a lot of things on who the oldest was, and if he, you could say that he kind of let him down. And then to top it off, he went and he married against his father's wishes. So, did he kill his dad in a fit of, I don't know, maybe he had an addiction with alcohol, or he was just mad. That thing that you, how many times you have to strike somebody with one of those iron dogs to kill them? Like very personal. And then again, it could have been somebody else, but, and that's why I'm saying that sometimes you find in some of these murder cases where there was like a high profile family or well known, or in other words, that they had some type of reputation in society. At some point, the family just wants, like, don't keep, like they were saying that one of the police chiefs got bought off. Like, we don't want you to keep investigating because we already know who it is, and this person is going to be just as dead. And if you keep investigating, it's going to drag the family name through the mud even worse because then this person is going to go to trial for having killed a family member. Plus, in the process, our dirty laundry is going to come out to go with it. So sometimes even the family themselves are the ones that impede the investigation because they're trying to salvage the best they can, which of course points to that family name or the how's this the appearance um, among society. And again, I'm talking about a family that has got like a reputation or something that they're like, no, you can't do that. We it's this is not going to be better. It's just going to be worse. Okay, next story out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories is Old Louisiana records tell of cursed tomb. In 1940, Lawrence Zerilli, who taught Italian at Alcée Fortier High School in New Orleans, was writing a history of Italians in Louisiana. In the records of the Mutuo Beneficenza, or Italian Benevolent Society, he came across a story concerning a costly tomb paid for by the society, which was believed to bring death to its creators. In modern times, it became known as the Hex Tomb. Joseph Albino Borelli Sr., a prominent merchant in the city, conceived of the idea for the tomb. He was president of the society, which had been established in 1843. Pietro Gualdi, an Italian-born artist, was commissioned to design it. The original plan was to number each block of stone, and he would send the specifications to New Orleans along with materials. However, the plans were lost in transit, and the society sent for Gualdi to erect the mausoleum himself. Gualdi traveled to New Orleans and erected the monument at a cost of $40,000 to the society. It was made of solid white marble imported from Italy. It was built in St. Louis Cemetery Number 1, unofficially known as the City of the Dead. The graveyard, crowded with its above-ground tombs, is located on Basin Street in Faubourg Trem and was opened in 1789. It replaced an earlier cemetery, St. Peter's, in the Vieux. Catholics and Protestants buried their dead in St. Louis Number 1 until Christ Episcopal opened Giroud Cemetery in 1822. Waldy had recently completed the tomb when he died from malaria in 1857, age 48, and was the first to entomb there. Upon Guetti's death in 1857, there probably was no ominous reputation attached to the mausoleum, since yellow fever epidemic struck the United States during the 18th and 19th century, especially port cities like New Orleans. The disease was not indigenous and was imported by ships arriving in the city. Between 1817 and 1905, over 41,000 succumbed to the disease and spurred the creation of many cemeteries in New Orleans. In 1853, the yellow fever epidemic was the deadliest in the city's history. Almost 30,000 people were infected and more than 8,000 died. Most of the deaths were among new arrived immigrants who lacked immunity to the disease. Native born residents had a much higher survival rate. As a result, commissions were initiated to recommend improved hygiene, waste disposal, and drainage. It was only at the end of the 19th century that Dr. Carlos Finlay, a Cuban researcher, discovered yellow fever's vector, the female Aedes aegypti mosquito, and only in the 1930s that a vaccine was developed. The saffron scourge, as the yellow fever was named, forced Creole families to build and inter their dead in the city instead of transporting the body to their family plantation cemetery. Such was the case of the Locoul family, who owned the Laura Plantation, a river road between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Raymond Brutus Locoul arrived in New Orleans in 1821 and married Elizabeth Duparc. The same year, she came from a Creole family who owned one of the largest sugar plantations in St. James Parish. He died in 1850 from yellow fever, and due to the fear of contagion, his wife was prevented from transporting his body to Laura Plantation. Instead, he was buried at St. Louis Cemetery Number 1. The majority of his family and their descendants were buried in the cemetery. Madame Locoul ran the plantation throughout the Civil War. She died in 1882, but even before her death, her children, Amy and Emile Locoul, fought over the property until 1879 when Emile died. His daughter Laura would go on to write a book titled Memories of the Old Plantation Home. Whispers of a hex on the Italian Society's tomb probably started when Joseph Borelli died within 18 months of Guetti's death. The superstitious attached the curse to anyone involved with the construction of the mausoleum. Contrary to popular belief, Borelli was not buried at this mausoleum. He was interred at a family tomb he designed for his 17-year-old son, Joseph Jr., who was killed when the steamboat Louisiana blew her boilers on November 15, 1849. A little over 5 p.m., this family mausoleum is located at St. Louis Cemetery Number 2. The boat had completed preparation for departure to St. Louis and was full of cargo and a large number of passengers. At the moment the vessel pulled away from the wharf, the explosion shook all the houses in the area down to their foundation. The steamers Bostana and Storm were lying at either side of the Louisiana and were heavily damaged. Passengers and crew on board these steamboats were killed as well. Passengers on the Louisiana who were not torn apart by the blast or scalded were thrown into the water and hit by debris. Others were carried down when the boat sank within 10 minutes of the explosion. It was estimated that between 150 to 200 lives were lost. Debris was hurled everywhere, along with human body parts. A large piece of one of the boilers was thrown upon the levee, and one entire, a mass of iron 15 feet long and weighing thousands of pounds, was thrown 600 feet from the river, landing within 3 steps of the door of the White Mansion Coffee House at the corner of Canal Street. Along the way, it cut through bales of cotton, cut a mule in half, and a horse and rider who were on the nearby levee. Captain Mason, pilot of the Storm, described her bodies fell from the air into the river like hail. The Times-Picayune reported on November 16, 1849, that Joseph Borelli Jr. was found and expected to recover. However, this turned out to be a mistake, and only his watch was found on the levee. Borelli designed the family tomb to depict the steamboat explosion and Joseph Jr.'s ascent into heaven in a bas-relief panel. 5 life-size angels adorned the top of the tomb. 4 years prior to the death of his son, Joseph Borelli Sr. had lost his wife Sarah Ann to scarlet fever. Lawrence Zarelli, who came upon the story, was an Italian-born barber. In his youth, he worked at a shop on South Clinton Avenue in Trenton, New Jersey. He moved to Tampa, Florida, and was ordained as a Baptist minister in 1908. By 1917, he had moved to New Orleans and worked as a professor at the Baptist Bible Institute. Reverend Zarelli passed away in 1952 at the age of 74. However, his only daughter, Marianne Zarelli, died in 1944, aged 22, 4 years after he came across the story in the records of the society. The Loggia Dante number 174 acquired ownership of the tomb in 1949 from the Italian Society. It was ceded to the cemetery in 1986. The opening scenes of The Cincinnati Kid from 1965 was filmed in St. Louis Cemetery Number 1 in New Orleans, specifically featuring a traditional jazz funeral procession heading to the cemetery at 425 Basin Street. In the 1969 movie Easy Rider, Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper with two hookers in tow, go to the cemetery for an all night party. The scene was shot at the Italian Mutual Benevolent Society Mausoleum. Filming took place without permission from the Catholic Church, who owned the cemetery and who were scandalized when the movie was released. Following the release of Easy Rider, the Archdiocese enacted a policy of disallowing any filming in its cemeteries, except in the case of pre approved documentaries and educational films. Peter Fonda climbed onto the lap of the charity statue adorning the mausoleum, and it is said that in order to heighten his acting, he began talking about his mother's suicide when he was 10 years old. Her name was Frances Seymour Brokaw Fonda, and she was a New York socialite who sued her husband Henry for divorce in January 1950 after 13 years of marriage. The respondent was Susan Blanchard, stepdaughter of Oscar Hammerstein. 4 months later, Frances Fonda committed suicide on April 14th. She was a patient at the Craig House Sanitarium where she was recovering from a nervous breakdown. Excuse me. A nurse found her in the bathroom with her throat slashed with a razor blade. She left a note that read, "Very sorry, but this is the best way out." Henry Fonda came to the sanitarium, sent his wife's body to a crematorium, and then returned to New York to continue his performance of the sold out show Mr. Roberts that he starred in. Under terms of her will, Frances left $300,000 to be shared with her mother, brothers, and sister, and eventually to go to her children, Jane and Peter. Another property in New Jersey was left to Frances Brokaw, a daughter by a former marriage. Henry Fonda was cut off. She had made the will out in October 1949, 6 months before she died. Frances Fonda's first husband was George Tuttle Brokaw, a man 29 years older than her, described by his first wife, Claire Booth, as an abusive alcoholic. He died in 1935 from a heart attack, and Frances married Henry Fonda the following year. Henry Fonda married Susan Blanchard 20 years his junior in December 1950. His daughter Jane Fonda, while writing her memoirs decades later, discovered her mother had been sexually abused as a child. Other New Orleans cemeteries, have been made famous as backdrops for films. Lafayette Cemetery Number 1, founded in 1833, is nestled in the heart of the Garden District and was featured in Anne Rice's vampire novels. The beautiful statue at the Italian Benevolent Society Mausoleum is named Charity, and it was vandalized in recent years. The head and one of the hands were broken off. Other statues were damaged as well. Were there others who fell victim to the curse of the Italia Mausoleum? It's not known. Perhaps the story developed through the years when the citizens of New Orleans visited the city's cemeteries. The tradition of All Saints' Day and All Hallow was observed by faithful Catholics, especially by the Creole families. They would attend Mass on November 1st, then visit their family tomb to prepare for November 2nd. This was known as the Feast of All Souls, or commemoration of all the faithful departed. Family graves and mausoleums were cleaned and prayers were offered for the repose of the dearly departed soul, especially if it was believed this person was stuck in purgatory. Perhaps it wasn't only the tomb but the cemetery as well. In 1848, Mary Jane Daly, alias Crazy Jane, was brought up on charges of disturbing the peace of the living and the dead at St. Louis Cemetery. She was ordered to pay a fine of $10, but she had no money and was committed for 1 month to a local asylum. She died in the yellow fever epidemic that swept through New Orleans in 1853. So there you go. You start off with this mausoleum that is beautiful. Remember, $40,000 when this took place was a lot of money. All right. And it ends up being in modern times in the movie Easy Rider. you know. And then, of course, there's always a backstory to what's going on where, the oh, obviously, it's really funny because Henry Fonda had this reputation as being this oh shucks guy, and he's a real son SOB. And then his son is recalling his mother's suicide as a way to, like, I guess, what, tear up. But still, there's always a story behind the story of what happens. And of course, everybody knows, anybody who's ever been to New Orleans cemeteries, since they're above ground, they're very visible. How's that? You go to other cemeteries, especially the newer ones in other cities, and everything is very flat because all the memorials are flat. But even now, well, these of course are old tombs, but because of the water levels, everything is very, very visible. And I've toured them. And I believe that last I heard was due to vandalism. And because, of course, everybody doing the TikTok and all that, now it's a guided tour that you have to pay for to go into the cemeteries. When I was there many years ago, you would just stroll in and walk through it. But yes, there's always a story within a story of all these things that happen. And again, I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if any other people that were involved in the actual planning of the original mausoleum, something happened to them because for it to get like this reputation is like, and just maybe nobody noted it. How's that? Okay, let's go into let's change gears on this one, and we're gonna go into modern times. All right, and this is uh, titled Pablo Escobar's Cocaine Hippos. During the 1980s, drug kingpin Pablo Escobar smuggled four hippopotamuses into his estate Hacienda Napoles. He was killed in 1993 and the animals were abandoned. Escobar was one of the founders of the Medellin cartel, which by the 1980s had become so powerful that it controlled 80% of the global cocaine trafficking and 75% of its market to the United States. Escobar purchased his 7.7-mile estate, Hacienda Nápoles, in 1978. He constructed a Spanish-style colonial mansion, an airport, several swimming pools, man-made lakes, and a sculpture garden. And let's not forget a zoo for exotic animals. Escobar was shot and killed by Colombian police on December 2nd, 1993. His widow Maria, his son Pablo, and his daughter Manuela fled Colombia in 1995 after failing to find a country that would grant them asylum. First, they went to Mozambique, then Brazil, and they settled in Argentina using false names. After Escobar's death, the ranch, zoo, and citadel at Hacienda Napoles were given by the government to low income families under a law called Extinción de Dominio, or domain extinction. In 2006, the estate was declared the property of the Colombian state. Its value was estimated at $2.23 million dollars. By the 2010s, a private company began operating the Parque Temático Hacienda Napoles. It's a theme park with water attractions, a wildlife sanctuary, and museums. Thousands of tourists come from all over the world, and the hippos are one of the main attractions. There is no denying that Escobar's connection to the park is a drawing point. Between the years it was abandoned and its reclamation as a tourist attraction, the hilltop ruins was ransacked by treasure seekers. Holes were dug in the floors in search of a stash of cash, and one over the top individual even showed up with a backhoe. I have to laugh because I'm telling you, when there's money or treasure to be found, all right. Despite the passages of time, people are still caught sneaking into the ground hoping to dig up and find any of Pablo's money. Okay. Escobar's plans were to build up an exotic zoo of wild animals. However, after his death, many of the animals died, and those that survived were moved to zoos around the country, but the hippos were considered too large and difficult to move. The 5,500-acre ranch located in the municipality of Puerto Triunfo, 124 miles north of Bogota, and the surrounding wetlands provided an environment in which the hippos thrived. Their descendants started showing up about 10 years ago. The hippos invaded extensive areas excuse me, of the Magdalena River basin in Colombia, and without any natural predators and the warm weather, they have done what all species do, reproduce. They have been found miles from Puerto Triunfo. In 2007, complaints were made when the crops were damaged, and a male called Pepe, who attacked fishermen and killed 6 pigs, was shot by a German hunter brought in by the Colombian government. The original 4 hippos brought by Escobar had multiplied to 16. Several animal rights groups protested the action, and the hunt for hippos was suspended. In 2012, a court prohibited it. By 2014, it was estimated the herd numbered about 40 hippos, and in 2019 they numbered about 100. and the range covers about 870 square miles. It's been found that Columbia hippos reach sexual maturity earlier than African hippos. In late 2021, the Colombian government authorized for 24 hippos to be chemically sterilized, and there was discussion of culling the herd. However, the communities at Puerto Triunfo welcome the presence of the hippos. They have become a part of the local identity. In response to this action, a U.S. federal court recognized the descendants of Escobar's hippos as legal persons. The ruling was in response to an application filed by the Animal League Defense Fund, or ALDF, to Colombia's proposed cull of the herd. The plaintiffs were the community of hippopotamuses living in the Magdalene River. In 2014, an Argentine court ruled Sandra the orangutan had been subject to unjust confinement at Buenos Aires Zoo. In 2019, she was settled in the Center for Great Apes in Wauchula, Florida. In other words, that was a precedent for it. Biologists warn the hippos can damage the biodiversity in the rivers, as well as negatively affecting crops, as they are herbivores which eat large amounts of food. They are aggressive and are known to kill people. In June 2023, 10 of Pablo Escobar's cocaine hippos were flown to El Chapo's homeland province of Sinaloa, Mexico. Their destination was the SUBSTACK sanctuary in the town of Jesus Maria in northwest Mexico. The goal was ultimately to return them to Africa in their natural habitat. Mexican conservationist Ernesto Zazueta footed the $500,000 bill. The youngest were selected in order to slow the birth rate within the herd. The 10 hippos are only a fraction of the ones that are now running wild in Antigua, Colombia. It's believed that by 2031, the hippos will number over 400. Research has found one of the main problems of the hippos population is their feces, which acts like a fertilizer. Bacteria and algae found in nearby lakes and rivers boom and cause algae blooms and create a lack of oxygen in the water for other organisms. Their concerns they could harbor diseases and parasites that will endanger other species, including humans. There's also the threat presented by the hippo's aggressive nature. Two of the original hippos were procured by Escobar from the San Diego Zoo, and two others were gifted by fellow drug lords, the Ochoa brothers. It's estimated that to transport one hippo cost about $40,000 or more. This herd of hippos are the only wild ones that can be found outside of Africa. 60 more hippos were being sent to the Greens Zoological Rescue and Rehabilitation Kingdom in Gujarat. In 2024, Colombian courts gave the go ahead to sterilize and hunt the hippos. Plans to relocate them to Mexico, India, or the Philippines with a price tag of about $3.5 million stalled out. In May 2025, it was reported that the violence from organized crime in Sinaloa forced SUBSTACK Sanctuary to close. The transfer of about 700 animals, including the hippos, was undertaken. The new sanctuary is known as Biopark El Encanto, located about 130 miles away. There were safety concerns for the staff, and veterinarians were not willing to make the trip to Culiacan due to the violence between the cartels. A mystery that persists is what happened to Escobar's $30 billion fortune. What has surfaced over 30 years have been properties, but not his liquid fortune. His family deny any knowledge of its location. What do you think? Would they know? Okay. Unable to launder the vast amount of money that came to him, it's rumored he started to hide it in rural areas, agricultural fields, and other locations. In 2016, a mansion owned by Escobar in Miami was searched by its new owner. Experts with metal detectors tore down most of the walls and found two safes. One disappeared and the contents remained unknown. The other did not have anything of value. In 2020, Pablo Escobar's nephew, Nicolas Escobar, found a stash of his uncle's money in one of his houses in Medellin. It totaled about $18 million, but the dollars were unusable since they had been buried for over 30 years and were too decayed. Philip Whitcomb, also known as Roberto Sendoya Escobar, claims he is Escobar's secret son. He claims his adoptive father stayed in contact with Pablo Escobar, who he supposedly met during a stay in Colombia during the 1960s. Whitcomb claims his biological father sent him a series of codes that would lead to his treasure in Colombia. However, he's been unable to prove either claim. His adoptive father, Patrick Whitcomb, a former British Secret Service agent, disclosed the truth to him in 1989. So, this guy Escobar, besides being a drug lord and importing hippos that have taken over a river in Colombia, has a secret son. I mean, he had children, obviously a daughter and a son, which, can you imagine that no country, even with all the money they must have had, was willing to give them, like, you can't, no, we don't want you here. Interesting, huh? And of all the things that this guy did, what's lasted is the herd of hippos. Interesting. And let me tell you something there. It's going to be interesting because these things are breeding quick. All right, next story is out of Mysterious Universe and is titled Strange Tales of Real Immortals. Humankind, indeed, all living things have always been tethered to aging and death. For all of our mastery of technology and medical knowledge, it is an inevitable, inescapable fate for us to grow old and die. For thousands of years, there have been those who would avert this creeping certainty of aging, who would break the cycle of deterioration, death, and decay. The quest for a way to remain young forever has consumed mankind throughout history. And if some stories are to be believed, there are those among us who have managed to achieve this. One such strange, supposedly immortal individual called New Orleans' home in the early 1900s, and by some accounts was more than merely an eccentric, but also an immortal vampire. The setting for this odd tale is the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, in the early 1900s, when one day a mysterious stranger came to town to take up residence at an opulent home at 1039 Royal Street. The stranger called himself Jacques Saint Germain and immediately made an indelible impression with his dashing good looks, charming demeanor, and obvious wealth. Indeed, he was known to splash about money as if it were nothing to him, and came to be known for holding lavish parties at his luxurious home, where he would entertain high society's rich and elite. It was not long before this stranger was the talk of the town, yet no one really had any idea of where he had come from, nor much about him at all, other than that he spoke both French, English, and Spanish fluently, and that he was well traveled, talked excitedly of his trips to far flung places throughout the world, but giving away very little personal information about himself. It didn't seem to matter, though, as the handsome socialite was so rich and charming, beguiling even that people overlooked it. As time went on, Jacques' eccentricities began to come through. He was rarely seen during daylight hours, and it was noticed that during his conversations he would often slip into talking about events in the far past, with such familiarity and with such a sentimental cast to his expression that it gave people the unsettling feeling that he had actually been present at these events, despite them lying sometimes centuries in the past. He also began to make bold claims that he was a direct descendant of the late Comte de Saint Germain, who was a mysterious European adventurer, philosopher, and prominent member of high society in the 1700s, as well as a personal friend and diplomat of King Louis XV. This was all taken with a grain of salt, and most took it to be said in jest, merely entertaining banter, but there were others who noticed that Jacques actually did bear a striking resemblance to Comte de Saint Germain, and seemed to behave very much the same as well. Rumors began to swirl, and before long there were whispers that not only was Jacques related to Comte de Saint Germain, but that they were one and the same. This even though he had died in 1784. Nevertheless, there was speculation that Jacques had somehow achieved immortality, an idea bolstered by the fact that Comte de Saint Germain was often said to be immortal, always appearing to be around the same age in all of his portraits, about 40, which was incidentally the same age as a mysterious Jacques, and he had been cited throughout the centuries looking as young as ever. On top of all of his other idiosyncrasies and his uncanny resemblance to his claimed ancestor, this led to suspicion that Jacques was perhaps actually an immortal, and had merely changed his identity from Comte de Saint Germain upon moving to New Orleans. This was bolstered by the fact that Comte de Saint Germain had often made bold claims that he was hundreds of years old and had found an elixir of everlasting life, on top of other bold and mysterious proclamations, with the famous Italian author, adventurer, and great historical womanizer Giacomo Girolamo Casanova himself, once writing of Comte de Saint Germain in his memoir thus: quote, "This extraordinary man, intended by nature to be the king of impostors and quacks, would say in an easy, assured manner that he was 300 years old, that he knew the secret of the universal medicine, that he possessed a mastery over nature, that he could melt diamonds, professing himself capable of forming out of 10 or 12 small diamonds one large one of the finest water without any loss of weight. All this, he said, was a mere trifle to him, notwithstanding his boastings and his barefaced lies and his manifold eccentricities. I cannot say I thought him offensive in spite of my knowledge of what he was and in spite of my own feelings. I thought him an astonishing man as he was always astonishing me." End quote. Another oddity that Jacques shared with Comte de Saint Germain was that although he threw decadent feasts and seemed to revel in people gorging themselves on food in his presence, he never seemed to actually eat anything himself. He was said to merely talk and observe, sometimes drinking from a chalice of wine, but never actually eating any of the food on display. This oddly mirrored an unusual observation made of Comte de Saint Germain by Casanova, who said of him, quote, "The most enjoyable dinner I had was when Madame de Robert Gurgy, who came with a famous adventurer known by the name of the Count de Saint Germain. This individual, instead of eating, talked from the beginning of the meal to the end, and I followed his example in one respect, as I did not eat, but listened to him with the greatest attention. It may safely be said that as a conversationalist he was unequaled." End quote. All of this led to people half jokingly suggesting that Jacques was not only immortal and actually Comte de Saint Germain, but possibly even a vampire. Although some people seem to have steadily grown to accept this as more than just a joke, Jacques de Saint Germain, of course, got wind of the rumors and seemed to get great amusement from it, enjoying stoking the gossip by neither admitting nor denying anything. It all seemed like a game to him, and only served to fuel the fires of the rumors. This might have been where the whole story ended, with Jacques Saint Germain merely remembered as an eccentric rich playboy, if it weren't for an odd incident that struck a few months after coming to New Orleans. One evening a woman was witnessed dropping to the street from one of Saint Germain's upper floor windows, with onlookers saying she had jumped. The woman, a prostitute, survived the fall, but was described as being absolutely terrified by something she had seen up in that house. Things got even stranger when she was questioned by police, during which time she claimed that the reason she had jumped was that Saint Germain had tried to ferociously bite her neck, causing her to fight him off with all of her might and fly into a panic, jumping out of that window to escape. Despite this rather dramatic testimony, Saint Germain laughed it off and was a well respected member of high society by that time, and the police told him that everything could be worked out the following morning. No one thought at all that he could have been guilty of what he was accused, and it was thought that the woman, a lowly prostitute in their eyes, was on drugs or insane. The authorities explained to him that his coming in for questioning was merely a formality and that everything would quickly be sorted out. St. Germain then pleasantly and politely accepted, wished the officers a good evening, and closed the door. It would be the last anyone ever saw of him. Within the next When the next morning came around, the police patiently waited for St. Germain to arrive, but he never did. Still not thinking him guilty of anything other than a poor choice of prostitutes, they nevertheless went to his residence to see what was going on. The house was found to still hold most of St. Germain's belongings, large amounts of valuables, and all of his furniture. The second floor of the residence was supposedly murky and heavily curtained, and as the police pushed into the gloom, they allegedly made a macabre discovery of numerous bottles containing a mixture of wine and human blood. Of the missing St. Germain there was no sign, and he would indeed never be seen again, disappearing into the night to leave raging rumors and all of that blood behind. With this strange and rather grim discovery, coupled with the sudden and mysterious disappearance of Jacques Saint Germain, the rumors of immortality and vampires quickly went from a sort of joke to very serious indeed, and the legend took off as those who had looked at these ideas with skepticism suddenly were faced with the realization that something very weird was going on indeed. People were now convinced that not only were Comte Saint Germain and Jacques Saint Germain the same, but that he was an actual real life vampire. Many things went into such wild reasoning. Why did they look so exactly alike? Indeed, there were also many similarities in both their personas and demeanors. Both were eccentric, rich ladies' men with a penchant for engaging conversation and spinning fantastical yarns, and both were well learned world travelers. It seemed too much to be a coincidence. Why was he seen almost always in the evening hours? And why was he never seen eating anything at his own luscious feast? How was it that he knew such details about events hundreds of years before? And why did he speak of these things as if they were as if he were there seeing them with his own eyes? Why was he so secretive with his personal information? And most importantly of all, why did he have bottles and bottles of blood in a darkened room? No one had a clue, but it all added up to a point to paint a very odd picture. The theory was further fueled by the fact that although Comte Saint Germain is considered to have been a real person, his actual history is rather murky and ill defined, making him quite the mysterious figure indeed, ripe for fitting him into all the madness. Very little is known about the man himself, where he came from, or even when and where he was born, or what his true name really was. This is partly because he changed identities and titles so often, but also because he was a social chameleon and considered to be a very skilled and accomplished liar in all things. One Lady Jemima York once said of him, quote, "He is an odd creature, and the more I see him, the more curious I am to know something about him. He is everything with everybody. He talks ingeniously with Mr. Ray, philosophy with Lord Willoughby, and is gallant with Miss York, Miss Carpenter, and all the young ladies. But the character and philosopher is what he seems to pretend to, and to be a good deal conceited of. The others are put on to comply with les manières du monde, but that you are to suppose his real characteristic, and I can't but fancy he is a great pretender in all kinds of science, as well as that he really has acquired an uncommon share in some." End quote. Put this all together, and it is very difficult to pin down any concrete information on him at all, making him almost like a literary character rather than a real person, and allowing people in retrospect to make up all kinds of wild tales about him as they see fit. There were also the many accounts of Comte de Saint Germain being very skilled in many areas of the arts and sciences, far beyond what would be expected from someone having lived only one lifetime. His declaring himself to be hundreds of years old, as well as much testimony that he was an actual alchemist. There are quite a few unverified accounts of him turning metal to gold or creating perfect diamonds from impure ones. And even when he was officially alive, there were rumors that he had used these powers to prolong his own life, perhaps indefinitely. Indeed, there were many who claimed that over the years he had not noticeably aged at all. This caused rumors that he had never really died at all, only moving on to take another identity, perhaps even to New Orleans. Combine this with the enigmatic nature of Jacques Saint Germain, all of the striking similarities, the mysterious crime and his subsequent vanishing, as well as the bottles of blood, and you have a perfect storm for the creation of an eerie legend. Now, it is quite possible that Jacques Saint Germain was just what he seemed to be, merely an odd rich fellow, nocturnal because of his hard partying lifestyle, and that he had certain kinks, such as biting women's necks and drinking wine mixed with blood. His freak flag flying high. Maybe he was afraid that he would be arrested, and that was why he skipped town. And his resemblance to Comte Saint Germain was just a coincidence. But where's the fun in that? Stories of ancient immortals and vampires are much more interesting, and this has caused the legend to grow. In the end, although it is all a fascinating story, there is little to actually verify or substantiate any of it, which has indeed allowed it to become the pervasive legend as it is today. Everything else has been obscured by murky history and countless retellings, making the truth evasive. The only thing we really know for sure is that both of these men were real and that they shared many similarities in both appearance and character. Other than that, we are left to wonder just who Comte de Saint Germain really was, and what connection he had to the mysterious Jacques Saint Germain, if any. This probably is all merely a coincidence, a misunderstanding colored by exaggeration, misinterpretation, and myth making. But what if there really was an ageless vampire who made his way from the old world to the new to come calling at New Orleans? What if Comte de Saint Germain really was an immortal, whether because of being a vampire or through some magical elixir of life? What if he is still out there now? Another tale orbiting the topic of immortals is that of the seemingly mythical Fountain of Youth. The search for eternal youth and a fountain of youth is a frequent fixture of various myths and legends from around the world. One of the earliest accounts of such a place comes from the 5th century BC, when the Greek historian Herodotus wrote of a fountain in the land of the Macrobians, which gave the people of the region exceptionally long lifespans. In the 3rd century AD, Alexander the Great was said to have searched for a fountain of youth, allegedly crossing a mythical land covered in eternal night called the Land of Darkness. To reach it, the legendary Christian patriarch and king Prester John allegedly ruled over land containing a similar fountain during the early Crusades in the 11th and 12th century AD. In Japan, stories of hot springs that can heal wounds and restore youth were also common and still are to this day. During the Age of Exploration, when European global exploration took off in the 15th century AD, interest in such a mythical fountain of youth had not waned. The New World of the Americas began to be seen as a potential location for a fountain of eternal youth. The Caribbean, in particular, was considered a prime candidate, as many islanders spoke of a lost land of wealth and prosperity known as Bimini, which became entwined with the legend of a fountain of youth. The fountain of youth was a hot topic in those days. The Spanish historian Lopez de Gamara wrote of the Indian accounts of a magical river, waterfall or spring that could reverse aging and could be found in the lands north of Cuba and Haiti. Pietro Martire de Angera, an Italian geographer living in Spain in 1513, wrote of the fountain as well, saying, quote, among the islands of the north side of Hispaniola, about 325 leagues distant, as said by those who have searched for it, a continual spring of flowing water of such marvelous virtue that the water thereof, being drunk perhaps with some diet, maketh old men young again. During this area of exploration of the New World, it was indeed the Spanish who took a particular interest in such a mystical spring, after hearing widespread talk of Bimini and fountains of restorative waters from the Arawaks and Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Florida was a land of many natural springs, and it was thought that one of these was the mystical fountain of youth of local legend. One name that has become inextricably linked to the quest for the fountain of youth is that of the Spanish explorer and conquistador John Ponce de Leon, who was the first governor of Puerto Rico and in 1513 led the first European expeditions into what would become Florida. It was alleged that during the explorations of Florida, while looking to find lost gold and claim land for Spain, the explorer had the ulterior motive of finding the lost land of Bimini, and thus the Fountain of Youth, which he was convinced existed. It was claimed that during his forays into Florida, the explorer would unofficially go off with a small contingent of men in an effort to locate the fountain. Although Ponce de Leon became connected to and perhaps best known for his quest for the Fountain of Youth, it has long been debated as to just how much fact there is to the story. One of the problems lies in the fact that there are virtually no surviving records of the expeditions to Florida written by Ponce de Leon himself, and the fountain is not mentioned in any that do exist. Most accounts that we know now were actually written long after his death by native Arrow in 1521. Nevertheless, historical references to the explorer's obsession with the mythical fountain abound. One of the best sources of information on Ponce de Leon's travels and search for the fountain is the writings of Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas, who was the chief historian of the Indies in 1596. Amongst his accounts, Herrera wrote in his impressively titled record, Historia general de los hechos de los castellanos en las islas y tierra firme del mar océano of Ponce de Leon's quest. Holy, what a long title. Quote, Juan Ponce overhauled his ships, and although it seemed to him that he had worked hard, he decided to send out a ship to identify the Isla de Bimini, even though he didn't want to, for he wanted to do that himself. He had an account of the wealth of this island, Bimini, and especially that singular fountain that the Indians spoke of, that turned men from old men into boys. He had not been able to find it because of the shoals and currents and contrary weather. He sent then Juan Perez de Urtubia as captain of the ships and Anton de Alaminos as pilot. They took two Indians to guide them over the shoals. The other ship arrived and reported that Bimini had been found, but not the fountain. End quote. This seems intriguing, but considering that it was written over 70 years after the explorer's death, one has to wonder how much veracity the account holds. This information could have been hearsay and was probably second or third hand information at best. An even earlier account in 1535, closer to Ponce de Leon's death, was written by a court chronicler by the name of Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo in his book Historia General y Natural de las Indias, in which he mentions the explorer going off looking for the fountain using information gathered from the natives of the area. Oviedo's reports is difficult to take at face value for several reasons. It is said that the chronicler did not like Ponce de Leon and wrote the account in a way that suggests the explorer was trouncing off on a fool's errand. In short, it is believed that the whole story written by Oviedo was an attempt to gain favor with the courts and was a political attack designed to discredit Ponce de Leon, excuse me, and basically make him look like an idiot. Hold on. Sorry. Oviedo even went as far as to suggest that Ponce de Leon quest for the fountain was part of a misguided attempt to cure his sexual impotency. Ouch. The political animosity between the two was understandable since Oviedo was in with Diego Columbus, who had helped to push Ponce de Leon out of Puerto Rico and just so happened to be the son of none other than Christopher Columbus. Due to this undying rivalry, it is hard to know how reliable Oviedo's account is. Even back then, everybody wanted to be at the front of the class. Anyway, let's keep going. Other historical accounts also make mention of Ponce de Leon's quest for the Fountain of Youth. In Francisco López de Gomara's Historia General de las Indias of 1551, the author describes Ponce de Leon's search for the fountain. In 1575, the author Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda wrote in his memoir that the Fountain of Youth was located in Florida and that the Spanish explorer had gone looking for it there. Fontaneda claimed to have been a prisoner of local natives for 17 years as a boy and described the Indians as making use of a lost river that contained curative water, which he says Ponce de Leon was looking to find. Fontaneda's account has a very skeptical feel to it, and the author seems to doubt that finding the fountain was the explorer's first priority. Although there is a certain romantic element to the idea of Ponce de Leon going off in search of fabled lands and mystical springs in the jungles of ancient Florida, it is uncertain if it ever happened at all. In the end, we are left with scattered historical documents that were written after Ponce de Leon's death, and none of which were written by the explorer himself, leaving his true intent and what really happened lost to the mists of time. This uncertainty regarding the historical quest for the Fountain of Youth has not stopped the legend from enduring. Some even claim that the explorer was successful in his mission, indeed, possibly still alive somewhere out there, enjoying his perpetual youth. To this day, there is a spring said to be the actual one that Ponce de Leon was searching for in St. Augustine, Florida, which is said to be the oldest city in the U.S. The Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park in St. Augustine has become a popular tourist destination where visitors can drink cups of water from this fabled spring. The park has seen various important archaeological finds such as an ancient cemetery and the ruins of missions dating back to the city's founding. Although the site undoubtedly has historical value, The elderly people who come to visit in droves have yet to miraculously regain their youth, and it is doubtful if Ponce de Leon ever even set foot in St. Augustine. I've been there at that site, St. Augustine various times, but at that site specifically. Whether Ponce de Leon ever really did search for the fountain of youth, there have nevertheless been stories over the years of those who have claimed to have found it. In 1989, the author Charlie Carlson allegedly interviewed a man who claimed to be a member of a secret society that had located the Fountain of Youth and was tasked with protecting it. The interviewee claimed to be 93 years old, whereas Carlson described him as looking around 40. The man claimed that the fountain had been found sometime before 1845 and that it was his society's duty to make sure that it remained secret from the world. This anonymous informant reportedly offered proof to back up his claims in the form of census records for all of the members who had lived past 110 years old, of which there were quite a few. Some had apparently lived to be up to 122 years old, while appearing to be much younger. Although many had died in accidents such as drowning, against which the magical waters offered no protection, not a single one was found to have died of old age. If there really is there really a secret cabal of immortals out there who have drunk from the fountain and have pledged to eternally hide its secret? Nobody knows. While in modern days it will likely be genetics and stem cells that lead to prolonged life, mankind's quest for immortality is not new and has taken many forms through the centuries, with various elixirs, magical charms, and famous artifacts such as the Philosopher's Stone, all reputed to grant everlasting life. Perhaps in the case of Florida's Fountain of Youth, there may be such a place tucked away among the many springs that are to be found here. Whether it is there or not, it is intriguing to imagine such wonders, and there will be those who will search no matter what, enamored with the notion that it could be possible to live forever if only they could find it. Maybe there are even those who already have. Lying off the southernmost point of Europe is the tiny picturesque Greek island of Gavdos. It is an isolated speck of land jutting out of the Libyan Sea near its larger brother Crete, only about 30 square kilometers in size, and sparsely populated with more goats meandering around than people, all surrounded by azure waters inhabited by dolphins and myrid sea life. It is a place of stunning beauty and has been a magnet for people looking to get away from society and immerse themselves in this dreamlike place. It is also the home of a mysterious group of people who claim immortality and go about their enigmatic business amid the breathtaking scenery, far from prying eyes. In Greece, this has become a place of mystery and is known as the haunt of a secretive cabal of immortals. To understand how this came to be, we have to go back to at first seemingly unrelated and tragic event in history. One of the worst nuclear plant disasters ever recorded in history occurred in Ivan-Kiev rayon of northern Kiev Oblast, Ukraine, in the city of Pripyat, and what was at that time the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic of the Soviet Union, near the border with Belarus. It was here when, October 26, 1986, a catastrophic nuclear accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which would claim the lives of 31 people, plus many more in later years, and send radioactive material spewing all over the western USSR and Europe, clear the immediate region of most of its inhabitants, affect nearly 7 million people, and cause environmental and health problems that still echo through and affect the area today. Among all the human suffering and trying to piece together what happened, many people were left sick and aimless, and one of these was a man only known as Andre. Andre had been a nuclear physicist in his past life before all of this, sent to Chernobyl in the aftermath of the catastrophe to do research. Unfortunately for him, he got very sick from the considerable radiation there and that forsaken place, finding himself in a facility full of moaning, dying people like him. Death was everywhere at the time, hanging over everything like a black fog, and Andre knew that no amount of medical care or medicine was going to help him. He had an epiphany and realized that the only way to beat his condition was to turn to other means. At first, this involved simply moving away to a rural village and living a simple life of work, sweat, and drinking lots of vodka, all of which he would claim helped flush out the toxins from his system. And then his mind turned to more esoteric means of extending his life and indeed achieving immortality. He began to gather about him a following of others like him, many of them other Russian scientists and colleagues, and they began to study philosophy and esotericism as two form a way of thinking in which hard work and a tough mind could alter the abilities of their own bodies through sheer will. They believe that through willpower, meditation, and shucking off our traditional ideas on life and death, we can essentially reprogram our physical bodies to never die. After 10 years of this, the group had grown to around 30 members, and it was decided that they needed a place where they could live away from the world to pursue their way of life, and they found it on the island of Gavdos in the late 1990s. They relocated to the island, which at the time had only a transient population of dreamers, drifters, artists, and hippies, and set up a sort of self sufficient commune, growing their own food and living off the land. They also built mysterious laboratories where they went about experiments, even at the same time that they performed rituals or ceremonies, all shrouded in secrecy and mystery. Their ultimate goal, immortality. They believe that through their various activities they can reach the next stage of human evolution, in which life eternal is possible, and it would be only the world and them. One of the members of the commune had ominously explained, "There won't be any new generation. We are the last generation. We won't permit the birth of people who are mortals. They are not needed." End quote. As soon as the group arrived, which is actually usually referred to as simply the group or the Russians, they immediately began gathering an air of mystique and legend about them. Rumors began to fly about, all fueled by the group's secrecy and the strange structures they built, such as a large green pyramid that sits among the scrub and foraging goats, like some inscrutable ruin from an ancient civilization. Another is a building built in the style of an ancient Greek temple, covered with cryptic glyphs, which was erected much to the chagrin of the other islanders. People began talking about how this mysterious group would perform miracles around the island and demonstrate magical feats, or how they were building an underwater tunnel that would lead to Libya. Other residents gave an anecdote of the group's strange powers. Quote, "One day someone from the neighboring village asked us to help them make a heavy tree trunk. Six of us tried to get the piece into his truck in vain. Then two really skinny men came. They just said, 'Okay, let's do this,' and they did." End quote. There were so many stories and rumors that it's hard to know where any real facts end and fantasy begins. Norwegian filmmaker Yorgos Mustakis, who has made a documentary on the island and its mysterious group, has said of these rumors, quote, "Many urban legends surround this group. Some thought that they came to this island to get cured from radiation. Others were saying that they are spies working for the KGB or CIA, working on a top secret program. Most of these stories were told by people who had already met them and had seen their constructions around the island." End quote. Although their most Although their exact methods for achieving their goals are not clearly known, it is mostly thought that the group's ideology is a sort of hodgepodge mix of simple living, magical ceremonies and rituals, religion, esoteric philosophies, and scientific experiments and research, through which they aim to reprogram the human body and reach the immortality they think resides within all of us. To them, death is not inevitable, and it can be warded off or even stopped. The members themselves are very cryptic and secretive about it all, with one commune member explaining in an interview with One World Crunch, quote, "Our bodies present so many possibilities of change that we don't use. Why? Because we create a lifestyle in which change isn't needed. A dead world that viciously influences us and turns us into dead people. We think that it is a true fundamental reason for death, the starting point of what we call psychological destruction. I used to work in a research center and I saw my whole future ahead of me. I realized it was controlling me and driving me towards a certain kind of death. So I decided to change course, to not follow that path and to create a different way of life for myself." End quote. Just how they exactly plan to do this is murky, although many people have tried to figure it out. And there are even supposedly intelligence agents who have tried to infiltrate the group to find out what they are up to without much success. The closest anyone has come is perhaps the filmmaker Mustakis, who believes that the group, which it must remember is composed mostly of former scientists, is not quacks or religious nut jobs, and that they know what they are doing. He has said of this, quote, "It is a huge study. The proof you are asking lies inside this study in the same way that the proof of, let's say, Einstein's relativity theory lies in the math. In the case of the relativity theory, of course, it was experimentally proven later on in labs, the CERN accelerator, etc. But first, before his theory was tested in practice, it needed a working theoretical framework. To put it another way, yes, the scientists definitely have a theoretical framework that works." End quote. What is this mysterious group up to out there? What secrets have they found? If any, mysterious groups like this have always been attracted to stories of the bizarre, and they often sort of become larger than life to the point where it is hard to disentangle fact from fiction. Whatever they are up to and whoever they are, they still seem to manage to keep their secrets. But on that little island, surrounded by deep blue seas, and depending on how successful they have been, perhaps they always will. Are any of these stories true? Are there people out there who have somehow managed to cheat death and escape its inexorable approach? How much truth do these stories hold? And where does reality begin and fantasy end? Whatever the case may be, it all shows that people are, and probably will always be, interested in the alluring idea of somehow avoiding the inevitable approach of death. So, what do you think? Yeah, I'm thinking of these last people on that island. You know what? They live on this little island, all secretive. I bet you, if any of them dies, just dies of old age. I'm talking where that they could explain it by accidental, like they said, like drown. They'll keep a secret because that's going to make them look bad. You know, you're supposed to be immortal, and one of your people drops dead or gets old. I bet you, if anybody just died, just natural causes, they'd be like, shh, shh, no, we're going to bury him tonight. Yeah, what time? What happened? No, he decided to go. If anybody asks, no, he decided to return to his homeland or something like that. They would never They would never admit that one of their own had died. At least that's my theory on that. And by the way, you think about that because everybody thinks, oh, being immortal, it would be great up to a certain point if you think about it, if everybody else, but I personally, I wouldn't want to outlive my family members, my kids. What for? It's like immortality has a heavy price. Well, anyway, guys, I hope you like this last section of Eerie News, and I will be back soon, very soon, because Eerie News, there's so much of it. Till next time.